Sup, I'm Yuri Gore, and I'm writing music all the damn time. The most recent of which was this soundtrack, right here. So this visual novel is about two gods from the Shinto religion, Hachiman and Suijin, and you making them fall in love. Or if you really want to make them not fall in love and tear them apart. If you want to do that for some reason. It's based around the Shinto religion. It's based in Japan. Visually, it's got a very Japanese aesthetic. So obviously, I was forced to write a very traditional Japanese score. So the instrumentation, as you will hear, is heavily based around that, using traditional Japanese instruments. But more than that, and this is what I'm really wanting to talk to you about today, is using traditional Japanese scales. How they're formed, how they work, and how I used them in this score. So in the score, I use a few different 3-note scales. And the way these 3-note scales work is you layer 2 3-note scales on top of each other to make a pentatonic scale. Normally when we think about Japanese traditional scales, we think about a pentatonic scale. But what it actually is, as I just said, is not a 5-note pentatonic scale, but 2 3-note scales that are connected. And it's really important going forward that we think about them as 2 3-note scales and not 1 5-note scale. We'll go more into detail in a moment, just kind of prefacing what's going to happen this. For the 2 characters, the yo mode was used for Suijin. I did it in reverse. I'll explain the details, the specific parts later, not really important. And that was the notes E, G, and A. And for Hachiman, the Miyakobushi scale, or the Mitsu mode, again, I'll get into those in more detail later, which is D, B, and A. So the main theme is written using the pentatonic scale of E, G, A, B, D. And it is used with a pentatonic scale, a very homogeneous use of this scale. And I thought that was a kind of cool way to do some foreshadowing for the score. You know, normally when we want to do this kind of foreshadowing where we're telling the audience that 2 characters are going to get together or fall in love or whatever, you might do like a layering thing of their themes or a call and response or something between their themes. But I kind of wanted to be a bit more subtle with that. So instead, I used their 2 character scales and made their 1 full scale, that pentatonic scale we spoke of, and then made a new theme for the actual game using that scale entirely. Aside from that though, and in that main theme, we don't use the 5-note pentatonic scale, we only use those 3-note scales. Continue talking about themes. For each of the characters, as I mentioned like 50 times now, they have their own 3-note scale, but they also have their own main theme, which I just played for you. Then, on top of that, I also gave them both their own instrument, which is only ever used for them. For Suijin, it's the shakuhachi, which is like kind of breathy and airy, which I thought was good for the god of water, because it's like flowy and smooth and stuff. And then for Hachiman, who's the god of war, I figured it was nice to have like the koto, because it's a bit tougher, it's a bit harder. And then I also, fun little timbre thing, was I made every single note that he plays on the koto to be doubled on a taiko. So you get this like, it's subtle, it's very subtle, and I'll play it now soloed where you can just hear those 2. But in the score, it's very, very subtle. You don't hear it, especially seeing as whenever I'm using Hachiman's theme, I'm also doing like drums come in on the taikos. So it's very, very subtle, but it adds a lot, and it's a really cool effect that I'm pretty proud of myself for. As I've said, we need to distinguish that these are not a 5-note scale and that these are, in fact, 2 3-note scales. So how do we do that, given that they're both, we've already seen the use of the pentatonic scale. So how do we then decipher that it's actually a 3-note scale and not just 3 notes of a bigger scale? So this distinction is made because of the root of the scale. And this is why when I said earlier that Suijin is using the yo mode, that I was like, but it's backwards kind of thing. Because technically, the root should be A. But I've changed the root to E instead because I wanted Hachiman's root to be A. So even though this is meant to be traditional and they wouldn't do that in traditional Japanese theory, whatever, dude, I don't care. It sounds good. Because they have these 2 different roots, even though they're playing over the exact same backing, except for the little taikos that come in extra for Hachiman, they're playing over the exact same harmony. Because they have a different root, it's perceived very differently. So when we hear the E root from Suijin, it over an E minor backing, it sounds kind of sad. But when we hear the A root over the E minor backing, it sounds kind of dark. And it doesn't sound sad per se. It just got this dark, kind of brooding kind of feel to it. That confuses you. You can think of it as the modes, where G Lydian sounds kind of mysterious and ethereal, while D major just sounds like that boring, happy, cheery kind of vibe, So they're the same key signature, but they have a different tonal center. And whilst I don't want you to think of these as Western harmony, it's really important that we separate our mind when we're considering the 2. But there is overlap there. And a similar thing can be said about the 2. But if they're just using the same 3 notes, or same notes from the scale anyway, how do we actually know that there's a changing of the root? How do you know? Brilliant question. Fantastic question, as always. So, how do we do that? Well, it all comes down to tension and release. Resolution, I meant. So there's a few ways that you can do this. You just don't end on the middle note of the scale. You can end on the other side of the scale. And I'm saying the other side because for Suijin, it starts on the root and goes up to A, whereas on Hachiman, it technically starts on the D and moves down to the root of A. So I can't just say the last note because it, whatever. You can just not end on the root of the scale. You can end on the opposite side. That's okay. Never end on the middle of the scale because that doesn't have this resolution that we want. But most importantly, you want to end on the root. Start on the root and end on the root. And move around for the root, I guess. Then there's another technique in traditional Japanese harmony theory thing, which is called scale extensions, where we take these 3-note scales and we add an extra note on the opposing side of the root. So for Suijin, it's the D on the other side of the E, and for Hachiman, it's the G on the other side of the A. So these scale extensions are not part of the scale, and you really should never think of them as the scale. You can't use them the same way you use all the other notes in the scale. Whilst we don't want to resolve on some of these other notes that I spoke of, we can still jump to them however we want. We can never jump to this scale extension, and that's really important. To make sure that we have this tension and resolution, it's kind of described like a pendulum, that it swings and swings too far and then comes back to the root. So that's the same way with adding these notes, is whenever we want to use these notes, we have to make sure that we're coming down to the tonic and moving onwards and then resolve back to the tonic. We can never resolve on this extra note. We can never start on this extra note. We have to make sure that if we use this extra note, we always resolve back to the tonic. So this technique is actually really simple. Like there's a few rules about it, but it's not too hard to use, and it's very, very helpful. Because before we only had 3 notes, and that's just, there's not many options you can do with that, you know. However, with an extra 4th note, technically that's a 33% expansion on the available notes, which is pretty big. So scale extensions can go the other way too. You don't want to do them often, and you're going to be very careful about it. But they can work on the other side too to make your own like pentatonic scale, if you like. I'm not going to expand on that. That's when things get really complicated. So try to avoid it. I'm just explaining this now because I did use it. That time I got a little cheeky with it. Held that G a little longer than I probably should have. But whatever. I'm not trying to sound like historically accurate. It's just meant to be a traditional sounding score. So hopefully you heard in that too how Sujin sounded really sad over those chords, whereas Hachiman's kind of sounded a bit dark, which again is coming from this E over E minor versus A over E minor. So it's like the natural minor sound versus the Dorian sound. I think it's really interesting how we get that sound. Because if we were to talk about the Dorian scale, the factor that makes it the Dorian scale is that flat third. So we don't have the flat third in there, which would be the C in A. But it still conveys the same feeling that the Dorian scale has. And that's entirely because we know where the root is. So we don't even have to hear that minor third to get that minor darker sound. As long as we're conveying the tonal center over a different key, we still get the same effect. I think that was a really cool, interesting discovery that I learned upon researching this. So again, I want to preface this, well, not preface because I've said it like in the middle of the video, but don't think of this as Western harmony. It's really important. There's a lot of overlap as I'm showing you, but don't think of it as Western harmony. It's only going to make things less succinct, I guess. It's going to create this weird divide where you're trying to build a bridge between the two. The reason that there's this overlap is because all music theory, regardless of whether it's European or Eastern or African or wherever, it's always going to have, it's always context based, right? Even in Western harmony, in the key of C, a G flat is a very dark, evil note. But in the key of D, well, now it's a really happy note, and harmonically. And in the key of C, back to C, where it was a really dark note, if we add a G, a D, and a B to that chord, all of a sudden now, it's a really cool note. It's a little bit, ooh, what's going on there? But yeah, now I'm going off topic, so don't do that. Just try to think of it as Western harmony or as Japanese harmony. Don't try to overlap the two. So one last thing about the modes is they do in fact have a major and a minor mode. Again, not to be thought of as major and minor modes. They're spoken about as major and minor modes, but not the same way that we have like relative scales, where one scale has its relative minor kind of thing. Oh, that's relative. I'm thinking of parallel. But you know what I'm saying, parallel scales. So these are two completely different scales, that happen to share almost the same notes, except one is seen as happy and one is seen as sad. For example, the Miyakobushi scale that Hachiman uses, which is D, B natural, A, also has another scale called the Ritsu scale, or mode, whatever, Ritsu mode, Ritsu scale, whatever, which is D, B flat, A. So the second one, the latter scale, is a very dark sounding scale, and I used it to convey dark sounding parts while still conveying his scale. Whereas the other one was used in more happier parts. It still is a pretty dark scale, but especially over the chords that I used. So yes, the way that the Japanese use this is in fact that same way, where they have one version being the happy part and one version being the darker part. But they're not seen as two sides of the same coin as we see like C major or C minor, right? We see them as the same thing tilted in a different light. These are two different scales which happen to share overlap, and because they do, they often interchange them. So it's a very subtle difference, but again, I don't want to... It's only subtle when we're thinking about them as Western harmony comparisons. Similarly, Sujin also has one, from E, G to A to E, G sharp to A. So like minor to major thing. I thought this was a really cool like mechanic in the theory. So I tried to capitalize this in the two endings. There's alternate endings, whether you get them together or break them apart. And if you break them together, if you put them together, make them marry each other or whatever it is, then they will have the good ending. And the good ending uses the major modes. Or you can break them apart and do the minor modes. Anyway, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed that. I didn't actually study it for this. This was just coincidental timing that as I was studying. But it was really cool studying all that traditional Japanese harmony and stuff. I suggest you read this book. Maybe I'll do a little book review on it. There's 3 volumes. They're very interesting. They're a little confusing at first, and there are some things that I just cannot agree with him on at all. And I don't know if that's necessarily a harmony thing or his specific analysis of it. But I'll get into that if I ever do a book review of it. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the video. It was really cool, really interesting for me. Hope it was for you too. And I hope you have a great day. Go listen to the new soundtrack.